The twin sisters were born into a world that had already decided who they were and what they would become. Their arrival on a sprawling Georgia plantation in the early 19th century was marked by celebration, not because of who they were as individuals, but because they were heirs to land, legacy, and power. From the moment they opened their eyes, enslaved hands carried them, fed them, soothed them to sleep. These hands were invisible in the stories told about the family, yet they shaped every hour of the twins' lives. The plantation itself functioned like a small kingdom, with the big house standing at its center, surrounded by fields that stretched endlessly under the southern sun. To the outside world, this estate represented success, order, and respectability. To the twins, it was simply home, a place of comfort, beauty, and rules that were never questioned aloud. They grew up identical in appearance, but bound even more tightly by circumstance. Tutors taught them reading, writing, scripture, and etiquette, preparing them to become refined Southern ladies. They learned how to sit properly, how to lower their eyes in polite company, how to smile without revealing too much feeling. Their lessons emphasized obedience and grace, yet also reminded them of their elevated status. They were taught that the world was divided into clear categories: those who ruled and those who served, those who were protected by law and those who existed beneath it. Slavery was not presented as cruelty, but as an unquestioned fact of life, woven into every meal they ate and every dress they wore. Despite this conditioning, the twins were not raised in isolation from the enslaved people around them. Unlike many children of their class, they spent their earliest years under the care of enslaved women who acted as nurses and companions. These women sang them to sleep, wiped their tears, and whispered stories that never appeared in books. Through them, the twins learned warmth and affection that felt deeply human, even if society denied that humanity in public. This closeness planted the first quiet contradictions in their minds, contradictions they would not yet understand, but never fully forget. As the twins grew older, their bond with each other became legendary within the household. They moved together, spoke in near unison, and shared thoughts without explanation. In a society that prized women for their future roles as wives and mothers, their closeness was indulged as charming, even admirable. No one suspected that this unity would one day make them dangerous. To their parents and neighbors, the twins were symbols of continuity, proof that the family line was secure and the plantation's future guaranteed. Suitors would come in time, and alliances would be formed just as they always had been. Daily life followed a predictable rhythm. Mornings were filled with lessons and needlework, afternoons with walks through manicured gardens, evenings with formal dinners where conversations never strayed beyond approved topics. The twins learned early how to perform contentment. They laughed when expected, expressed gratitude on command, and rarely spoke of their private thoughts. Silence was not forced upon them, it was modeled. They observed how their mother avoided certain subjects, how their father spoke of people as assets, how pain and punishment happened out of sight, yet close enough to be understood. Even as children, they sensed the plantation's hidden violence. The crack of a whip in the distance, the sudden disappearance of a familiar face, the fear that flickered briefly in an enslaved person's eyes before being replaced with practiced calm. These moments disturbed them, though they lacked the language to articulate why. Questions were discouraged, and curiosity was gently but firmly redirected. The twins learned that survival in their world depended on not seeing too much, not feeling too deeply, and never challenging the structure that sustained them. Religion played a central role in shaping their understanding of morality. Sundays were reserved for sermons that emphasized obedience, divine order, and the righteousness of the Southern way of life. The twins were taught that God had assigned everyone a place and that questioning this order was sinful. Yet even within the church, they noticed differences. White worshippers sat comfortably while enslaved people stood at the back or listened from outside. The message of love and salvation felt unevenly applied, and though the twins could not yet explain their discomfort, it settled heavily in their hearts. As adolescence approached, expectations tightened around them. Their bodies became sites of scrutiny, their futures discussed openly by adults who assumed their compliance. Marriage was no longer a distant idea but an impending reality. They were reminded that their choices would reflect on the family name and that duty outweighed desire. The twins listened, nodded, and outwardly accepted these truths. Inwardly, they clung to each other, sharing doubts in whispered conversations late at night when the plantation finally fell silent. The world beyond the plantation gates remained largely theoretical to them. Stories of cities, political tensions, and growing unrest were filtered through the voices of men, who believed women had no role in such matters. Yet the twins sensed that change was stirring somewhere beyond their controlled environment. They felt it in the anxiety of their elders, in hushed discussions that stopped when they entered the room. Though sheltered, they were not ignorant. They understood that their way of life was fragile, dependent on force and fear, even if it pretended to be stable and eternal. What made the twins truly different was not rebellion, but awareness. They noticed details others ignored: the humanity in those denied freedom, the cost of comfort paid by unseen suffering. Their upbringing had given them privilege, but it had also given them proximity. They lived too close to the truth to fully accept the lies. Still, they did not yet know what they would do with this awareness. They were young, constrained, and watched constantly. Resistance had not yet taken shape, but the soil for it had already been prepared. By the time they reached adulthood, the twins had mastered the art of appearing exactly as society expected. They were admired, envied, and considered ideal examples of Southern womanhood. No one suspected that beneath their calm expressions lay questions that refused to disappear. Their shared silence was not emptiness. It was a space where forbidden thoughts grew quietly, waiting for the moment when circumstance, emotion, and courage would collide. The world believed it knew who the Georgia twins were. In truth, it had only seen the version they were allowed to show. The two enslaved men entered the twins' lives so early that it was impossible to remember a time before them. They were not introduced formally, not assigned significance, not spoken of as individuals in the way white children were. They were simply there, part of the plantation's machinery, like the fields, the stables, the long dirt paths worn smooth by labor. Yet, for the twins, these men were never faceless. From childhood onward, they occupied a constant presence at the edges of daily life, close enough to be familiar, distant enough to be forbidden. As boys, the enslaved men worked near the main house, trusted with lighter tasks because they had been raised under constant observation. They fetched water, carried messages, tended horses, and assisted with chores that required proximity to the family. This closeness was not kindness, it was convenience. Still, it created a strange intimacy. The twins grew accustomed to seeing them every day, hearing their voices, recognizing their expressions. Over time, these details accumulated into something more than recognition. They became knowledge, quiet, unspoken, and dangerous. The twins were taught never to address enslaved people as equals, never to ask personal questions, never to acknowledge emotion. Yet children often break rules without understanding why they exist. As girls, the twins spoke freely, laughed easily, and treated the men with a casual warmth that unsettled older eyes. They did not yet understand that such familiarity violated invisible boundaries. When corrected, they obeyed, but the correction could not erase what had already formed, the sense that these men were not objects, but people who remembered, felt, and observed. As years passed, childhood innocence hardened into adolescent awareness. The twins began to notice the physical toll of labor on the men's bodies, the scars left unexplained, the exhaustion carried silently. They noticed how differently the men behaved in the presence of overseers versus when they believed themselves unseen. They saw intelligence restrained, humor muted, anger swallowed whole. These observations unsettled them, forcing comparisons they were never meant to make. They began to recognize the contradiction between what they were, ought, and what they witnessed daily. The enslaved men, for their part, understood the danger of visibility far better than the twins ever could. From a young age, they learned to measure every word, every glance. They knew that closeness to the master's daughters could bring privilege, but also punishment. They navigated this narrow path with care, performing obedience while guarding their inner lives fiercely. Yet proximity has a way of wearing down even the strongest defenses. Familiarity breeds recognition, and recognition breeds connection, whether permitted or not. As they grew into adults, the dynamic subtly shifted. The twins were no longer children protected by innocence, and the men were no longer boys. Glances lingered longer than necessary. Silence became charged. Conversations, though still restrained, carried weight. The plantation's routines forced repeated encounters, moments when eyes met and quickly turned away. Nothing explicit was spoken, yet everything was understood. In a world where enslaved people were denied autonomy, even the acknowledgement of mutual awareness felt radical. What made the bond especially dangerous was its symmetry. Each twin found herself drawn to one of the men, mirroring the other in ways that felt inevitable. This was not discussed openly, not even between the sisters at first. It existed as an intuition, a shared understanding that did not require language. The twins had always mirrored each other, and now that pattern extended outward, binding four lives together in a configuration that defied every rule governing their society. The men offered something the twins could not find within their social circle: honesty without performance. With white suitors, the twins were expected to act, to charm, to suppress complexity. With the enslaved men, there was no future to negotiate, no expectations to fulfill. Their interactio, NS, limited as they were, felt grounded in reality rather than illusion. This contrast made the forbidden connection all the more intoxicating. It was not merely desire, it was recognition, a sense of being seen without pretense. Yet the imbalance of power never disappeared. The twins were always aware, however uncomfortably, that they possessed legal authority over the men's lives. This knowledge haunted them, complicating every emotion. Affection carried guilt, desire carried fear, even kindness felt contaminated by the system that granted them control. For the men, the danger was even greater. Any perceived intimacy could be interpreted as defiance, any misstep punished severely. They carried the burden of restraint not only for themselves, but for the women whose lives would also be destroyed by discovery. Secrecy became both shield and prison. Moments of closeness were fleeting, hidden in routine tasks, stolen glances, brief exchanges that meant everything precisely because they were so small. The plantation's constant surveillance made every interaction risky. Walls seemed to listen. Eyes appeared everywhere. The four learned to communicate through absence as much as presence, through what was not said rather than what was. Over time, the connection deepened beyond emotion into shared loyalty. The twins began to quietly intervene when they could, offering protection through subtle gestures, assignments near the house, lighter duties, delayed punishments. These actions were small within the vast cruelty of slavery, yet they carried meaning. The men understood the risk the twins took, just as the twins understood how inadequate their efforts were. This mutual awareness bound them closer, forging trust in a world designed to destroy it. As whispers of marriage and expectation grew louder around the twins, the tension became unbearable. Suitors visited, futures rediscussed, and choices narrowed. The enslaved men watched this unfolding with a mixture of resignation and fear. They knew how such stories ended. Separation was inevitable, violence was likely. Yet something within the four refused to accept the script written for them. What had begun as familiarity had evolved into attachment, and attachment into resolve. The men were not naive about the danger. They understood that love offered no protection under law, that intimacy could not override chains. Still, they also understood something else, that to deny what had formed between them would be a different kind of death. In a system that sought to strip them of humanity, choosing connection became an act of self-definition. For the twins, acknowledging this truth meant confronting the reality that their privilege was built on the suffering of those they loved. By the time the idea of a pact first surfaced, tentative, unspoken, terrifying, it did not feel sudden. It felt like the inevitable consequence of years lived too closely to injustice to ignore it. The four stood at the edge of a choice no one before them had dared to make openly. Their bond, forged in silence and sharpened by fear, had reached a point where neutrality was no longer possible. To move forward meant defiance. To retreat meant betrayal. In the shadows of the plantation, bound by secrecy and longing, the enslaved men had become not only the center of the twins' lives, but the catalyst for a decision that would change all of them forever. The decision did not arrive in a single dramatic moment, but emerged slowly, shaped by fear, exhaustion, and an unspoken understanding that time was running out. For months, the four of them existed in a state of suspended tension, aware that the world around them was tightening its grip. Suitors grew more persistent, overseers more watchful, routines more rigid. Every day that passed without action felt like surrender. Yet action carried consequences so severe that even imagining them caused the twins' hearts to race. What they contemplated was not simply forbidden. It was unthinkable within the moral, legal, and racial order that governed their lives. The idea of a private vow began as a whisper, barely formed even in thought. It surfaced in glances held too long, in pauses heavy with meaning, in the shared recognition that what bound them already resembled marriage more than any arrangement society could offer. They spoke of it first in fragments, never directly, testing the edges of possibility without naming it. Words like promise, together, and always appeared cautiously, surrounded by silence. Each understood the risk of speaking too plainly, yet each also understood that silence alone could no longer protect them. For the twins, the weight of what they proposed was staggering. They had been raised to believe that marriage was a public contract, sanctioned by church and state, designed to preserve property and lineage. To imagine marriage stripped of witnesses, legality, and approval felt like tearing the concept down to its most dangerous core. Still, that core, commitment freely chosen, was precisely what drew them forward. They were not rejecting marriage itself. They were reclaiming it from a system that denied its meaning to those it enslaved. For the men, the proposal carried a different, darker gravity. They knew that no vow could alter their legal status, that chains did not dissolve in the presence of love. Agreeing to such a pact could expose them to punishment far worse than anything they had already endured. Yet refusing felt equally unbearable. To deny the bond that had sustained them through years of dehumanization would be to accept the lie that they were incapable of such commitment. In choosing whether to agree, they were choosing how they would define themselves in a world determined to define them as property. Planning the night required precision born of desperation. The plantation never truly slept, but there were moments when vigilance softened, when routines created predictable gaps. The twins studied these patterns as carefully as any overseer studied labor schedules. They chose a night when their father would be away, when the moon would offer light enough to see but not enough to expose. They selected an abandoned outbuilding at the edge of the property, long unused and partially hidden by overgrowth. It was a place already forgotten by the plantation's present, which made it suitable foe. An act that had no future within that world. Every step toward that night felt unreal, as though they were moving through a dream shaped by fear. The twins carried themselves as they always had, performing normalcy with practiced ease. Meals were eaten, conversations held, laughter offered when expected. No one suspected that beneath this calm exterior, each heartbeat marked a countdown. The men, too, performed obedience flawlessly, careful not to draw attention, careful not to disrupt the fragile cover that protected them all. When the night finally arrived, it did not announce itself with thunder or spectacle. It came quietly, like every other night before it. The air was heavy, thick with summer heat and the scent of earth. One by one, they made their way toward the outbuilding, taking separate paths, timing their movements to avoid notice. Each step carried the knowledge that discovery would mean ruin. There was no turning back once they crossed that threshold. Inside the building, the space was bare and dim, illuminated only by a single lantern brought for the purpose. Dust clung to the air, disturbed by their presence. The walls bore marks of past use, reminders that even abandoned spaces carried history. They stood facing one another, four figures bound by circumstances that had never allowed them to stand as equals, yet united in that moment by choice. There was no officiant to guide them, no script to follow. What they did next would be shaped entirely by their own understanding of commitment. They spoke softly, voices trembling not from uncertainty, but from the enormity of what they were doing. The twins went first, acknowledging openly what could never be spoken elsewhere, that they loved these men, that they chose them not out of rebellion alone, but out of recognition and respect. They vowed fidelity, protection where possible, and loyalty that no law could command. Their words carried both devotion and apology, an acknowledgement of the power they held and the harm they could not undo. The men responded with a gravity that silenced the room. They spoke not as property, but as husbands in every sense that mattered to them. They promised care, honesty, and steadfastness, knowing that their ability to act on these vows would always be constrained. They did not ask for freedom they knew could not be given. Instead, they claimed dignity where they could, asserting their right to love and be loved, even if history refused to record it. There were no rings, no signatures, no blessings from above. Yet the absence of these symbols only sharpened the meaning of what they had done. This was marriage reduced to its most essential elements: choice, promise, and mutual recognition. In a world obsessed with ownership, they had created something that could not be owned by anyone else. When the vows were complete, they did not linger. They understood that sentimentality could be fatal. The lantern was extinguished, the space returned to darkness, and they departed as carefully as they had arrived. By morning, the plantation would awaken unchanged, unaware that its moral foundation had been quietly challenged in the night. The pact they formed extended beyond that moment. They agreed on rules designed to protect one another, discretion above all else, no gestures that could invite suspicion, no words spoken in anger or frustration. They accepted that their marriage would exist entirely in secret, sustained by memory and intent rather than recognition. This secrecy was not a betrayal of their bond, but its necessary condition. Yet secrecy came at a cost. From that night forward, every interaction carried added weight. A glance meant more. A word held layers. Absence became harder to bear. The twins felt the strain of living Ubul lives more acutely than ever, their public roles increasingly hollow. The men carried the burden of protecting not only themselves, but the women whose lives would be destroyed alongside theirs if the truth emerged. Fear became a constant companion, but it did not erase resolve. If anything, it sharpened it. The knowledge that they had chosen one another freely in defiance of a system designed to prevent such choice gave their lives a clarity they had never known. Even in moments of despair, that clarity endured. They understood that history would not celebrate them, that their story would likely be erased or distorted. But they also understood something equally important, that the value of their pact did not depend on recognition. It existed because they had willed it into being, because they had refused to let law define the limits of their humanity. In the years that followed, that night would return to them again and again, sometimes as comfort, sometimes as torment. It would stand as proof that, even in the most oppressive circumstances, people could claim agency in the only way left to them. The Forbidden Pact of 1847 was not an illusion or a fantasy. It was real, fragile, and dangerous, and for that very reason it mattered more than anything else they would ever do. The first signs of danger appeared so subtly that none of them could say exactly when safety began to slip away. Life on the plantation continued as it always had, but something in the air felt altered, as if the ground beneath them had shifted by a fraction too small to notice at once. The twins sensed it in the way conversations paused when they entered a room, in the way their mother's eyes lingered on them with a new sharpness. The men sensed it in the tightening discipline, in the overseer's questions that carried too much curiosity, in the sudden insistence on order where routine once been enough. Suspicion did not arrive loudly, it crept in, patient and observant. Rumors were the first to surface, though no one could trace them to a single source. A whispered comment passed between servants, a sideways glance exchanged between neighbors, an offhand remark made at a dinner table and quickly dismissed with forced laughter. On plantations, information traveled along invisible routes, carried by those who had learned to survive by watching and listening. The enslaved quarters buzzed with quiet speculation, not out of malice, but out of fear. Anything unusual near the big house was dangerous knowledge, the kind that could draw violence down on everyone nearby. The twins became increasingly aware that their behavior, once overlooked as eccentric closeness, was now being reinterpreted. Their refusal to entertain suitors seriously, their habit of moving together rather than separately, their visible discomfort with certain social rituals, all of it began to look less charming and more suspicious. In a society built on rigid expectations, deviation invited scrutiny. What had once been tolerated as youthful independence was now framed as defiance. For the men, the shift was even more immediate. Privileges that had been quietly granted were suddenly questioned. Assignments near the house were reassigned without explanation. Overseers lingered longer than necessary, eyes sharp, voices measured. Innocent mistakes were punished more harshly, as if discipline itself were a test designed to provoke reaction. The men responded with caution, suppressing even the smallest gestures that might attract attention. Yet restraint could not erase history. Too much had already been observed, remembered, and noted. The plantation's white community played its role with practiced subtlety. No accusations were made openly at first. Instead, concern was expressed under the guise of propriety. A visiting relative mentioned the importance of marriage for young women. A neighbor commented on the dangers of indulgence toward enslaved workers. These remarks carried warnings without names, threats without confrontation. The twins understood the message clearly. They were being watched, and patience was wearing thin. Within the household, tension thickened. Their father's authority became more pronounced, his questions sharper, his tolerance narrower. He spoke often of reputation, of legacy, of the dangers of moral decay. Though he never named the source of his unease, the implication was unmistakable. The twins felt themselves shrinking under the weight of his attention, forced to measure every word, every movement. Even within their shared silence, anxiety grew. They spoke less freely to one another, afraid that even their closeness might now appear incriminating. The enslaved community felt the ripple effects as well. Increased patrols at night, stricter enforcement of rules, sudden inspections, all justified as routine measures, yet understood for what they were. Fear spread quietly, because fear always did. People avoided eye contact, conversations shortened, trust frayed. Everyone knew that when white suspicion hardened, punishment rarely stopped with its intended target. The breaking point came not with an accusation, but with an observation that could not be explained away. One evening, an overseer noticed an exchange, brief, restrained, yet unmistakably intimate in its familiarity. It was nothing dramatic, a shared look, a pause too long, a closeness that defied the rigid distance expected between white women and enslaved men. Yet in that moment, suspicion crystallized into certainty. The overseer said nothing then. He did not need to. He had seen enough. From that night on, the plantation felt hostile in a way it never had before. Silence no longer felt neutral. It felt dangerous. The twins sensed that decisions were being made beyond their knowledge, conversations held behind closed doors. They heard raised voices late at night, their father's anger barely contained. They understood that once authority moved from observation to action, there would be no opportunity for explanation or mercy. The men were confronted indirectly at first, questioned about unrelated matters, tested for inconsistencies. Each question carried an edge, designed to provoke fear or confession. They answered carefully, knowing that honesty was not the goal of these interrogations. The truth, once suspected, did not require proof to justify punishment. All it required was the appearance of defiance. As pressure mounted, the twins faced a cruel realization. Their silence, once a form of protection, was now being interpreted as guilt. Any attempt to defend the men would only confirm suspicion. Any denial would sound hollow. They were trapped within the very roles that had once shielded them. Their privilege could not save them now. It could only determine the manner of their fall. The plantation's moral order demanded resolution. White society could tolerate many sins, but not those that threatened its foundational hierarchy. The idea that white women might willingly bind themselves to enslaved men was not merely scandalous, it was existentially dangerous. It undermined the logic of slavery itself. To preserve that logic, the system had to respond decisively. When confrontation finally came, it was swift and brutal in its efficiency. There were no public trials, no formal charges, no opportunity for defense. Decisions were framed as necessary corrections, actions taken to restore order. The twins were separated and confined under the guise of protection. Their movements were restricted, their correspondence monitored. They were reminded relentlessly of their duty, their shame, their obligation to comply. The men faced consequences even harsher and more immediate. They were removed from the plantation under cover of night, sold or transferred before dawn could bring questions. No goodbyes were allowed, no explanations given. Their absence was explained away as routine business, as if lives could be erased as easily as entries in a ledger. The violence of this erasure was not limited to physical separation. Records were altered, incidents omitted, details smoothed over. The official story became one of discipline restored, of youthful indiscretion corrected. Anything that did not fit this narrative was discarded. Memory itself became a battleground, and those without power lost it first. For the twins, the aftermath was a hollow existence, surrounded by familiar walls that now felt like a prison. They carried grief that could not be named. To speak of what had been taken from them would invite further punishment. They were expected to resume their roles, to accept approved marriages, to bury their defiance beneath obedience. Outwardly, they complied. Inwardly, they mourned not only the men they had lost, but the version of themselves that had dared to choose differently. The plantation returned to its routines, but something had fractured irreparably. Those who remained felt it in the way laughter sounded forced, in the way trust never fully recovered. The system had reasserted itself, but at a cost it would never acknowledge. It had exposed its own fragility, its dependence on fear and erasure to maintain control. What lingered longest was not the punishment itself, but the knowledge that love had been treated as a crime worthy of destruction. The whispers faded, replaced by silence enforced through terror. Yet silence does not mean forgetting. Beneath the surface of compliance, memory endured, fragmented, painful, and stubborn. The dangerous discovery did not simply end a secret. It revealed the lengths to which power would go to preserve itself, and the price paid by those who dared to challenge it. The forbidden pact did not survive intact, but neither was it fully destroyed. It lived on in absence, in the spaces left behind by people erased too quickly to be mourned properly. And in that quiet, history carried forward a truth it would never officially record, but could never completely silence. What followed did not unfold as a single dramatic ending, but as a slow, deliberate erasure designed to leave as little trace as possible. In the days after the men were taken away, the plantation moved with an unsettling calm, as if silence itself had been ordered into place. There were no public explanations, no acknowledgement of loss, no space for grief. The absence of the two men was treated as administrative necessity, not human removal. Their names were no longer spoken, their labor was redistributed, their existence was folded neatly out of the present, as though it had never intersected with the lives of the twins at all. The twins were kept apart at first, a calculated cruelty disguised as concern. Family members spoke gently but firmly, framing separation as protection rather than punishment. They were told that emotional instability was dangerous, that closeness had led them astray, that obedience would restore balance. Each sister was placed under constant supervision, their days structured down to the smallest detail. Privacy disappeared. Letters were screened, movements monitored, conversations observed. The world narrowed to approved routines and rehearsed expressions of remorse. What made this confinement especially punishing was its psychological precision. No one accused them outright of what they had done. Instead, they were surrounded by implication. Every sermon they were made to attend spoke of sin and repentance. Every conversation about marriage emphasized duty over feeling. They were praised for submission, rewarded for silence, corrected for hesitation. The system did not need confession, it required compliance. And compliance over time was forced through exhaustion. The twins learned quickly that grief itself was a liability. Tears prompted concern that could turn into scrutiny. Silence invited suspicion. Even memory became dangerous. They disciplined their thoughts as carefully as their behavior, training themselves not to linger on faces, voices, or promises. Yet suppression did not mean release. What they had lived could not be undone by denial. It settled instead into their bodies, surfacing in moments of dissociation, in sleepless nights, in the hollowness that replaced joy. Within the wider community, the incident was absorbed into the fabric of acceptable forgetting. Neighbors understood without being told. Everyone recognized the signs of correction carried out to preserve order. Polite society did not ask questions that would demand uncomfortable answers. Reputation was salvaged through silence, and silence was treated as virtue. The twins' future marriages, when they came, were framed as redemption stories, proof that youthful indiscretion had been properly extinguished. The men's fate was more opaque, and deliberately so. They were sold under different names, transferred to distant plantations where no one knew their history. This physical displacement was accompanied by narrative erasure. Ledgers recorded transactions without context. Ages, skills, and prices were listed, but nothing of character, attachment, or loss. In the economy of slavery, separation was routine, and routine violence required no explanation. Yet human memory does not follow the rules of rec. Ord-keeping. Among the enslaved, fragments of the story persisted, carried carefully through whispers and warnings. People remembered the sudden removals, the fear that followed, the way order tightened afterward. These memories were not preserved for sentimentality, but for survival. They became lessons about proximity to power, about the dangers of being seen, about how quickly lives could be rearranged by forces beyond control. For the twins, time did not heal so much as dull. Years passed. New roles replaced old ones. Children were born, duties multiplied, appearances maintained. To the outside world they seemed restored, absorbed back into the expected rhythms of womanhood. But restoration was an illusion. Something essential had been amputated, and no amount of conformity could replace it. Their lives continued, but on terms they had not chosen. What endured most powerfully was not the memory of joy, but the knowledge of what had been taken. They understood, perhaps more clearly than those around them, the violence required to maintain the world they lived in. They had seen how swiftly love could be reclassified as threat, how easily people could be erased to preserve hierarchy. This understanding made them careful, inward, and profoundly isolated. They belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. As decades passed, the story receded further into obscurity. Official histories made no mention of it. Family records omitted anything that might raise questions. The plantation itself changed hands, then faded into ruin, its fields reclaimed by time. Yet absence has a way of speaking, in damaged documents, in inconsistencies between oral accounts and written records, in unexplained decisions that altered family lines. The outline of the forbidden pact remained faintly visible. Later generations encountered these traces without context. A missing entry, a sudden sale, a pair of sisters whose lives diverged inexplicably after a certain year. On their own, these details meant little. Together they formed a pattern that resisted complete erasure. History, even when silenced, leaves pressure points where truth presses back through. The most enduring legacy of the pact was not romance, but defiance. What the four had done could not dismantle slavery, could not save them from punishment, could not rewrite the law. But it exposed the lie at the heart of the system, that power alone could dictate human bonds. For one night, and in the years that followed within memory and consequence, that lie had been challenged. The twins carried that knowledge to the end of their lives. They never spoke of it openly, but it shaped how they moved through the world, how they understood obedience, how they recognized the cost of comfort. They knew that history would not honor them, that their choices would be framed as shame if ever discovered. Yet they also knew something quieter and more enduring, that for a moment they had acted not as symbols of power, but as human beings capable of choosing love over law. The men's legacy was harder to trace, but no less real. Wherever they were taken, they carried with them the memory of being chosen in a world designed to deny choice. That memory, though dangerous, was also sustaining. It affirmed an identity that slavery sought to erase. Even if no record preserved their names, their experience resisted total annihilation through the simple fact of having been lived. History often presents itself as orderly, governed by dates, laws, and outcomes. This story refuses that structure. It survives instead in fragments, in silences, in the uncomfortable spaces between what was written and what was done. It reminds us that not all acts of resistance are loud, and not all consequences are visible. Some are buried deliberately, only to resurface generations later as questions that refuse to disappear. The Forbidden Pact of 1847 did not end with justice or triumph. It ended with survival, loss, and silence. But within that silence lies its meaning. It reveals how power maintains itself, how love threatens systems built on dehumanization, and how even the most carefully controlled histories cannot fully extinguish truth. What history tried to bury was not merely a scandal but a challenge, a moment when the boundaries of race, law, and ownership were crossed not by force but by consent. That moment was destroyed, but it was never undone. It remains as evidence that even in the darkest structures of oppression, people reached for one another, claimed dignity where they could, and left behind a story too human to be erased completely.